Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bowermaster and ESM webinar series. My name is John Bondre, and I'm an advisor here at Bowermaster and Associates. As you know, ESM is our safety and claims management partner, and the goal of these webinars is to provide you with a resource that is both educational and also beneficial to your operations. Today's webinar is on analyzing loss runs and extrapolating trends. This is very important for your business as it affects you both financially and just the overall culture within your organization. Attendance today, everyone that's in attendance is going to receive a certificate of completion as well as a follow-up email with useful information from today's webinar. I know we've got a lot of content to go over. We've got some case studies to go over. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our safety and claims partner and more importantly, our expert, Anthony Poston. Good morning, Anthony.
Hey, John. Thanks, everybody, and good morning. So thanks for joining today's call. Special thanks to the wonderful Bowermaster team for coordinating these events. A special shout out to Mike and Adam and Hope and John and the rest of the awesome Bowermaster team for making these webinars happen each month. Now, we have a large audience, as we typically do on these, and we have a lot of material to cover. So a quick note before we do, I know we are scheduled for 30 minutes or less, but just to give you a heads up, we might go a bit over today. So if you have to duck out early, don't worry, this presentation is going to be recorded and it'll be posted on the Bowermaster website, and we'll also be sharing the slides at that point as well, probably be later this week. So let's get started. Now today we're going to talk in depth about workers' compensation loss runs and what information is important to analyze. So with that, do you have someone in your organization that reviews loss runs? If so, how often? And if you don't, you can request these from your Bowermaster advisor and they can help you review and analyze them. Now, if you are reviewing them, what information are you extracting? Is it meaningful data? Is it data that you can synthesize to help make risk management decisions? I will say, I will say in today's audience, we have a wide spectrum of industries, and I'm sure there are various levels of injury frequency represented here. But regardless, if you have injuries or claims, it is important that each of you review and monitor your loss runs to ensure costs are maintained and trends are mitigated. Don't expect the system to look out for your best interests or be your advocate. If that was the case, ESM wouldn't exist. So be sure to review losses, develop a safety plan, continue to monitor your pulse at all times to ensure you are minimizing the cost and impact of workplace injuries. So here are some helpful hints to ensure your loss runs are analyzed effectively. First, it's important to know that data going in will help you analyze data coming out. So when you are reporting an injury to the carrier, be sure to be as specific as possible. The more information you provide, the better you can trend this data over the next 5 years. And we'll talk about the specific types of data in upcoming slides. Now, you probably know that loss runs are completed for each policy year. And if you've had multiple carriers over the past few years, all the more reason to ensure the data you provide is detailed. This will help you manage claims with prior carriers in subsequent years. Now, depending on your size and complexity, you should review loss runs at least quarterly. And for more complex companies, I recommend monthly, and I'll share a few case studies at the end where we review and analyze loss runs monthly at each safety committee meeting. Now, you can request loss runs in Excel, which makes it easier to slice and dice the data. And if the carrier doesn't offer that, you can subscribe to Adobe Acrobat DC, and there's an export function that allows you to export PDFs into Excel, which I do pretty frequently. Now, we're going to cover the last two bullets in coming slides, but these are useful tips to ensure you and the adjuster are proactive in managing the cost and impact of your claims. All right, now regardless of which carrier you're with or you're going to be with, these are the top 3 elements that underwriters use to make a decision about your level of risk. Now, the first is lag time in reporting. And this is the time from which you have knowledge of the claim to when the claim is reported. And I'm going to share an example shortly where a client's poor lag time record almost resulted in a non-renew from the carrier. Now, the second, return to work. It is easy to check a box and say that you have a return to work program, but it is more evident to an underwriter who's analyzing how much temporary disability you paid, or TD, how much TD you paid on your claims. Now, TD occurs when employees are off work. And the longer the employee is off work, meaning there's no modified duty being provided, the more the temporary disability is paid. Now, that TD and those lost days directly impact your XMOD and your workers' comp premiums. So again, if you say that you have a return to work program, it should be reflected in the lack of temporary disability paid. Now, you can also measure the effectiveness of your return to work program by looking at your OSHA 300 log and seeing how many lost days you've had versus how many days of modified duty you've provided. And then number 3, historical trending. Now, this is an easier measurable as the underwriters are looking at your frequency and severity of injuries. And the higher the frequency, the greater chance of a severity claim, statistically speaking. Now, I'll share an example of that in an upcoming case study as well. Well, I threw this slide in to show the different types of loss runs, but it really didn't have the impact that I was hoping since I had to redact all the client and claimant data. But nevertheless, what you can see here is that most loss runs look similar and provide basically the same information. Some provide a greater in-depth analysis on trends like Pacific Comp, Travelers, Berkshire, and some of the other premium carriers. But to really maximize that carrier's data trending, you'd need to be with that specific carrier for an extended period of time, say 5 years, where the carrier can then provide detailed trends on your injuries. And remember, the data coming out is only as good as it is going in, so the initial input has to be detailed. Now, the challenge many of you face is that with multiple carriers over the past few years, that means that you have to request multiple loss runs that come in different formats, from which you then need to extract the relevant data and then format it so that it aligns with your trending matrices. Now, this can be a challenge since the coding of injuries can vary from carrier to carrier, as in, do the loss runs identify the cause of injury, the body part injured, or is it just a brief generic summation of the injury? For example, the activity may be described on the loss run as Anthony hit his elbow, causing a contusion. Well, was it his right or left elbow? What did he hit it on? What department does Anthony work in? What shift? And on and on. Now, if you're a smaller organization, you might already know these details, but when you have 20 or 30 plus claims a year, these details are important as they are going to be reviewed by others looking at the loss runs, and those others won't have your institutional knowledge of the claim or the employee. All right, here's a quick summary as to the types of claims you'll see on the loss runs. These are not hard and fast rules by any means, but we have incident only, medical only, and indemnity. Now, under incident only, not all employers report the incident only cases. In fact, most of our clients only do this when there are red flags surrounding a possible injury. Now, for medical only claims, these typically close within 90 days. And if you're reviewing your loss runs and see that medical onlys are open longer, then be sure to reach out and question the adjuster. You definitely want those claims closed and for the lowest dollar amount, especially around your unit stat time, which occurs 6 months into the policy. Well, actually, it's more 18 months into the policy, but that's a whole nother webinar training. Now, if it is first aid as defined in the labor code and through OSHA's 14 first aid definitions, it is not a recordable injury on your OSHA 300 form. Which, by the way, if you've not heard, as of July 3rd, 2018, California employers are not required, I repeat, not required, to submit their OSHA 300 online. I actually spoke to a Cal OSHA consultant, and they advised that there is no requirement under Cal OSHA's Title 8 requiring an employer to submit their logs electronically, and therefore they cannot enforce it. Now, we may see that change in future years, but for now, it's not a requirement. And I added a link, which you can see on the left side there, that links over to a blog that we explain a little bit more. Now, for indemnity claims, I've seen as low as $2,000, but this is more for TPAs because they charge differently based on claims handling. But again, this is just a brief summary of each type of claim that you may see on your loss runs. All right, as of March 31st, 2018, which is the most current data that we have through the Workers' Compensation Insurance Rating Bureau, the Bureau as we call it, or the WCIRB, the average cost of a lost time claim in California is $72,000, which is relatively flat compared to prior years. However, how many widgets do you have to sell or man hours you have to work to offset a $72,000 loss? So for simplicity purposes, although claims of this size get discounted towards your premium and your XMOD when they're calculated, let's just use some basic math here. If your company operates at a 10% margin and you have a $72,000 claim, you would need to generate $720,000 to offset that cost. So again, how many widgets do you have to sell or man hours you have to work extra to cover that increased expense? Something to consider at your next safety committee meeting. All right, let's talk about lag time. Now, lag time is defined as the number of days from when the employer had knowledge of a claim to the date that claim was reported to the carrier. Now, the legal requirement is that you must report the claim within 5 days of knowledge. And we recommend a best practice of 24 hours. And I just spoke to the senior loss control consultant for Pacific Comp, and they actually require 3 days. Now, granted, sometimes this is out of your hands, but this is where training and enforcement of your injury and illness prevention program comes into play. All employees must report injuries, no matter how small, to their supervisor at the time of occurrence. It is then the supervisor's responsibility to either notify the internal claims coordinator or your safety manager, or they complete the appropriate paperwork and then provide it to the company's claims coordinator. It's really that channel of communication that sometimes slows the reporting process down and ultimately impacts the cost of the claim as medical treatment is delayed. In fact, historical statistics state that claims filed 1 month or more after an injury cost 48% more to settle than those reported in the first week. And that's primarily due to delays in medical treatment and recovery, as well as increased litigation costs. Therefore, it is important to not only review your loss runs and monitor your lag time, but also to provide training and hold responsible parties accountable to your standard operating procedure, your SOP. Now, lastly on this slide, there are a few examples of where lag time might get bottlenecked. So let's take a look at an actual example. Oh, I'm sorry. Here are some helpful hints. We'll get to the example in just a second. Remember, underwriters evaluate you based on your reporting timeframes. They want to know that they have a good partnership with you and that you're going to notify them of potential issues so that they can act fast to mitigate the cost and impact of the claim. So again, be sure to report all incidents timely. And then internally, you want to clarify and include those reporting requirements per your IIPP. So include that in new hire training and then provide refreshers frequently. And be sure that you have a designated point person assigned to report all the claims, and then ensure you have a backup that's available and that they're also trained in the process. And a quick side note here, if a serious accident occurs, serious as defined by OSHA, you need to notify Cal OSHA within 8 hours. So ensure your backup is aware of this and that they have Cal OSHA's local enforcement number available. And you should also train your supervisors on accident investigation, which would include that same date reporting requirement. And then lastly, establish lag time goals. Track those results, hold managers responsible to achieve those goals, and let's take a look at that in this next slide. Okay, this is a manufacturing client that has about 55 claims. They had 55 claims in the 2015 policy year, of which 45% of them were reported late. And most of those were reported 30 plus days late, which is really late. Now, each month I meet with the safety committee, as well as the carrier's senior loss control consultant. They're there at the safety committee. And he advised us that their company executives had an internal meeting on this specific account, and that if late reporting continued, they would non-renew. Now, this client's historical trends were really poor, and thus the carrier felt pretty exposed. So the safety committee defined a new target goal for the following policy year, which was to have 75% of all claims reported within 5 days or less. Now, the other 25% we considered outliers, as we were still establishing safety initiatives, communication channels, and trying to streamline reporting requirements. But at the end of the 2016 policy year, we achieved our goal of not only reducing the injury frequency by 50%, but also achieving our lag time goal. Now, the claims that were reported late, which you can see here in yellow, they had perfectly viable explanations, including that last one, which was 148 days late. And that was due to a post-term employee that filed a claim via an applicant's attorney, and the carrier was the first one to have knowledge, which we fought, by the way. Now, the next few slides will discuss additional trends to review when looking at your loss runs. Now, if you're a client of ours, then you'll be familiar with our historical trending summary report that we provide on a quarterly basis. And we summarize the financials for the policy years that are impacting your XMOD. Now, carriers typically look at the past 5 years of historical summaries, not just the years that impact your XMOD. And those trends, those trends include injury frequency and severity. And recall what I mentioned before in a previous slide, that severity can be an indicator of either an effective or a non-existent return to work program. Now, an effective return to work program will typically have lower severity trends, by having lower temporary disability paid, as well as lower litigation rates and lower potential fraud cases. And we're going to talk about that in a case study in upcoming slides. Now, loss runs can also be useful in helping you identify injury trends, as in this case. Now, these are real numbers from a client, and we outline safety initiatives and training to mitigate these as quickly as possible. Now, in this case, we can see that strains and sprains accounted for 47% of the frequency, while slips and falls are about 39% of the severity. Now, the foreign body in the eye was one claim, and it was actually a safety violation where the employee did not wear his safety goggles when using a chemical, and it splashed back in his eye, which then got infected, and he had to have surgery, and it became a $100,000 claim. Now, from these trends, we focused our efforts on minimizing slip and fall exposures, and we minimized slip and fall exposures by improving housekeeping practices. We implemented new floor scrubbers. We provided new slip-resistant shoes for employees that were working in those high-risk zones. And then for strains and sprains, we reduced the amount of lifting and material handling, as well as staging of the product to reduce the amount of distance that the material had to be carried. Now, this actually resulted in a large injury frequency reduction in the next policy year, which again, I'm going to dive into in a case study here shortly. Okay, here are some other examples of charts that we use to look at overall trends, and this represents about 5 years of data, but it keeps us aligned with our safety goals. Ultimately, we want to reduce injuries, and if we target specific trends and focus our efforts solely on those for a quarter, you can typically see immediate results. And not only in the numbers, but in the financials and also just in the cultural awareness and employee support, which creates that participatory safety culture that you really want in your organization. Okay, moving on to some other data that you can glean from your loss runs, date of hire versus date of injury. Now, OSHA statistics say that 80% of injuries happen within the first 6 months of the job, which to me makes sense as I've seen plenty of organizations hire an employee and then immediately put them to work without any proper orientation. Now, this in itself can be really challenging to the employee as they're probably not conditioned to do the work, especially in laboring jobs. So I recommend you review your onboarding process and ensure that employees are set up to succeed and that they don't get injured. This is not only good for mitigating costs, but again, good for corporate culture. Employees like to know that they're receiving the proper training and that they're set up to be successful. Making sure that they have a breath and a pulse and then throwing them out into the job can be devastating for them and for you as well. So here's another example of how you can measure date of injury versus date of hire. Now, in this client's case, we identified that 61% of all injuries were occurring within the first year of employment, and that 75% of the severity was happening in that same time period. So we extrapolated out a year and found that 97% of the frequency and 100% of the severity was happening within the first 2 years of employment. This client had about 200 employees, and in the past 2 years, they'd probably hired about 35 to 40 new employees, some due to turnover. So we analyzed and discussed this at the safety committee and found that our hiring practices and our new hire onboarding process were severely lacking. So that then resulted in the following initiatives. First, we updated the job descriptions to include detailed physical requirements of the job, and then we reviewed those in the interview process and the first day of onboarding. Second, we created a new hire safety orientation process, and that included an administrative onboarding where the employees are trained on the IIPP and the company's code of safe practices, and also included proper reporting of injuries. That was then followed by a department onboarding orientation that included reviews of job safety analysis and standard operating procedures for the equipment that they were going to be working with. And that was then followed by a 15 and 30-day review by the supervisor to ensure the employee was well oriented into their position. Now, I added that last bullet there at the bottom to remind you that you should follow the same process for temp employees. They are under your watch, and therefore you are responsible for them, especially in the eyes of Cal OSHA. Now, if there's an injury that occurs with a temp employee, that falls on the temp agency, but OSHA has specific rules around protecting temps within your workforce, and you can follow that link there to find out more. Okay, here is the last slide before I move into a few case studies. Location coding. Now, this is something that you can request to be added to your loss runs, but you have to do it at the time of inception. So you just need to notify the carrier of your numbering system, and then advise layers that you want to track. As you can see here, we've got department, supervisor, and so forth. Now, in this next slide, I'm going to show you how a client made a very impactful business decision based on location data. Okay, so case study number one. Now, I had worked with this company for about 2.5 years, and we evaluated the data I mentioned in the previous part of this presentation on a monthly basis, and we evaluated a lot more as well. Now, this is a janitorial company with close to 250 employees, and I think they topped out at actually 280 at one point. And they primarily had hotel clients and some very notable ones here throughout the Bay Area. Now, most of their crew worked at night, and they either worked alone or in small teams. And we did have knowledge that many of these employees worked multiple jobs and that the night shift had its inherent risks due to fatigue. Now, the safety committee consisted of 8 of us, including senior management and field supervisors, and then we also had the carrier loss control consultant in attendance every month. We all analyzed the losses, we identified potential risks, we monitored trends, and we strategized on goals and supporting initiatives each month. And one conversation sparked an intensive review, and it resulted in a major shift in their business. And that question was started by the discussion of location coding. So we wanted to determine the frequency and severity of injuries by property and by shift. So at policy inception, we asked the carrier to add our codes assigned to each property. And then at each meeting, we started to track the progress. And with over 45 claims, the trends really started to stand out pretty quickly. So just a side note here, Pacific Comp was the carrier, and I really like their loss runs, and I have a great relationship with their senior loss control consultant. Their loss runs provide a significant amount of trending information, which is extremely helpful in developing safety initiatives. And not all loss runs do that. You can extrapolate that information, as I've shown you before, but some carriers actually offer that as just part of their loss run format. So one thing they don't do is offer loss runs in Excel. So again, I had to extract it using Adobe Acrobat DC, export that into an Excel file so then I could slice and dice. And that helped us really drive into making some pretty core decisions to the business. So this is a sample of the 30 plus sites that they had. I couldn't fit all of the data in this presentation on this slide, so I just picked some of the important data to share in this presentation. Now, we set a threshold of 3 injuries per site, and we wanted to see what sites had breached that threshold. And here you can see sites 1, 6, 7, and 18. They had a higher frequency of injuries. Next, we wanted to look at types of injuries by site. So we tracked first aids, medical onlys, and indemnity claims. Again, we're extracting all this from the loss runs. And this really started to frame our analysis. Again, sites 1, 3, 6, and 18 were trending higher than the thresholds that we had established. And site 16 was on the fence since they had multiple indemnity claims. So we were keeping a close eye on that one. Next, we tracked severity by property, and this magnified the trends even further. Now, I know these numbers are overlapping and somewhat hard to read down below there, but the gist of this is that sites 3, 6, 16, and 18 were continually trending above the thresholds. Now, for site 14, which you can see had the highest severity due to one claim, we dug in deeper and we found that one indemnity claim was really an outlier compared to all the other trends. And in fact, that property had been a long-term client and had a great team and a great track record, so we excluded that from our analysis. Okay, so after our loss run trending analysis was complete, we had determined that sites 3, 6, 16, and 18, which I'd noted before, were the leading injury frequency and severity sites. So we then assigned a workers' comp premium cost to each of these sites and asked HR to do an internal audit of administrative and management oversight to these properties as well. And I'll note during that year, we actually had an industrial hygiene test conducted to test the air quality when the kitchen cleaners were cleaning the ovens. The chemicals that they were using gave off a really strong odor, and the cleaners were using cartridge respirators unbeknownst to management. So we tested the environment and it came back clean and that no respirator was required. So we sent a memo to all kitchen cleaners. We created a job safety analysis and trained them on it. And then when we asked the employees to sign off on the training, site 18, their employees refused. So 2 weeks later, we got a letter from Cal OSHA asking for a response to a complaint about the kitchen cleaning. Surprise, surprise. So we responded with our IH results. We stated the OSHA standard, and there's actually a specific letter that supported everything that we had done. We sent that to OSHA. We said we were in compliance, and then we never heard from Cal OSHA again. But it was just another negative mark on a site that was already trending really poorly. Okay, so switching over to the results. So through the loss run analysis, our work comp analysis, paired with the management and administrative costs of these 4 sites, we determined that these clients were unprofitable, as well as they were key drivers in the workers' comp premiums, having the highest frequency and severity. They also required a substantial amount of time and headaches to manage. And additionally, these clients were union employees, and the collective bargaining agreements, the CBAs, took additional time and provided very little help for adherence to the company's return to work program and modified duty. So it was always an uphill battle. So the results, the client canceled all those union contracts, and then they redefined their customer profiles and realigned their marketing and sales efforts targeting new customers that fit that avatar. So it changed their whole business model. They also hired a night supervisor to float between the remaining properties to provide training and support and inspections. And when we did the cost benefit analysis, it made total sense to have a supervisor float amongst these properties because that resulted in 75% reduction in injuries and 50% less in workers' comp premiums, which was partially due to the smaller workforce. So again, extrapolating that information out of the loss runs, putting the analysis together, and then having those management discussions really changed the direction that this business started to go on. Okay, second case study. And this is related to a food manufacturer that has about 200 employees. They have a high frequency of injuries, which I've kind of shown in previous slides in the beginning. And they had a death case in 2014. And their XMOD was over 250%, and their premium was over $1 million a year. And that pretty much ate into all of their profits. So we established a safety committee in 2015 and started to define goals and analyze the loss runs monthly to ensure we were on target. So same process as before, only we were tracking all data sets: frequency, severity, lag time, date of hire versus date of injury, return to work initiatives, lost days, and so much more. But we were, again, extrapolating that information out of the loss runs, exporting it into Excel, slicing and dicing it, and then coming up with some charts and graphs that allowed the safety committee to have real discussions on initiatives that were going to help move the needle in the right direction. So we conducted a historical analysis of their frequency, and you can see here they were trending in the wrong direction as of 2015. And they were coming off a really bad 2014 year where they had the death case. So it took a substantial amount of negotiating by the broker to land a pretty good carrier that was willing to take the risk to insure them. But ultimately it paid off. So through our safety initiatives, coupled with excellent leadership from the CEO and their senior management, as well as new engineering improvements across the plant, we were able to achieve some pretty amazing results in a short time frame. So when we're analyzing the loss runs, one thing stuck out, that they had a significant number of first aid injuries, which led to deeper discussions around the types of injuries occurring and then best practices to mitigate them. I'll note that the safety committee was comprised of about 14 people, including the CEO, department managers, the HR director, myself, the carrier loss control consultant, and even the broker. And that was great because we had the broker and the loss control consultant aligned to the story, and all of those reports from the loss control consultant back to the underwriter and senior leadership at the carrier helped make sure that the company didn't non-renew, and they stuck around to see what the results were going to be based on all of the initiatives that we had established. Unfortunately, in 2015, we saw a big uptick in frequency because we were reporting everything, which I'll share in a second, and that really scared the underwriter and the carrier to possibly non-renew. But again, with the broker and the loss control consultant kind of writing the story and making sure that they understood that the culture was shifting, it helped resolve some of those concerns. So here's an analysis of their claims versus indemnity claims. And this client, again, as I mentioned, was reporting everything from every little scratch, what they called boo-boos, and they were fearful that the carrier was going to non-renew, so they just reported everything. So we analyzed the first aid claims that we saw in the loss runs and started testing different scenarios. So what if these first aid claims were managed in-house or by using a company called Onsite, which is a team of first aid responders or paramedics that kind of float around different regions to help provide first aid treatment. So we developed a process around this, and then we started testing it. Now, granted, if an employee needed medical attention, we sent them to the clinic. But what we found is that most of these injuries were really less than minor, even less than first aid. So we found that most employees also didn't want to go to the doctor when they were offered the option. Many declined to go, versus before they just sent them to the clinic as a knee-jerk reaction. So when those employees declined, we had them complete a declination form of medical treatment, but we also ensured that they understood that they could go at any time should they need it. We also offered an alternative, which was on-site. The paramedics came out to the premises and actually treated any first aid responses. And those paramedics were bilingual and extremely helpful, and the employees really appreciated the care. So for every first aid injury, we logged it, and then the HR manager was tasked to follow up with the employees within 3 days. If they weren't getting better, we sent them to the clinic immediately. If they needed to see on-site, we called them. If they were better, then we noted it and closed the file. Additionally, we started monthly trainings around safety and exposures and tasked the supervisors to provide positive behavior recognition. And this all started to shift the culture as the employer started to care more versus shoving them aside and just sending them to the clinic, which we found was not really in our best interest because the clinic wasn't a great advocate. So that too was part of the evaluation, and subsequently we switched medical providers. So this also resulted in a 78% reduction in total claims and a 61% reduction in indemnity claims over the following years. Now, in addition, there was an average of 4 litigated claims per year, and that went to 0. So a pretty significant shift in frequency and severity in litigation within a short time frame by just looking at some loss runs, extrapolating the information, and then making some informed safety decisions. So here's an example of a first aid log that we're using. We track by employee, department, nature of the injury, treatment, if on-site was utilized, which again is the first aid paramedics, if further treatment was advised, and then a follow-up date. And then we track the cost per on-site visit because we want to know how much we're paying them. And then did the employee get referred to the medical clinic? And for the most part, we found that those first aid injuries are less than first aid. They actually didn't get referred to the clinic. On-site was extremely helpful. And then that started to reduce our overall frequency and severity. So we set new goals for the following policy year, which was to have 28 injuries or less, whereas we were having 55 in the prior year. And you can see we were right on the money. And if you look at that first aid row, you'll see that we only had 1 first aid injury, which was in January. And that was when we actually started to kick off the new first aid program. So looking at the loss runs in prior years, analyzing them, understanding that first aids were a high taken frequency, putting together a specific initiative around reducing that, we then saw the benefits of that in subsequent years, which again, from an underwriter standpoint, who's not at the safety committee or not on site, they're just looking at the numbers, and all of a sudden it starts to look like those safety initiatives are really having an impact, which they were. Okay, so we also tracked severity. And unfortunately, in January, when we were kicking off this program, we started off in a hole with a large claim. But the safety program really started to resonate, and immediately thereafter, the only other blip we saw was in June. But we were building substantial momentum, and you could feel it through the company, especially in the safety committee, as everyone was aligned to the goals, they were aligned to the vision, and they were playing their part. And the problem solving and support was really starting to resonate and trickle throughout the company. And that's because we started to really see the impact. Reducing the frequency, reducing the severity, providing on-site, it started to change the culture, and people were participating more in the program than they had ever before. Now, our frequency and severity goals were being achieved. The carrier loss control rep was praising the group and reporting back glowing recommendations to the underwriters. We ran an analysis on Compline, which you'll see at that bottom bullet point there, and determined that an employer of this size has an average of about $178,000 in claim costs each year. So that's our new goal, our new target. And so far this year, we're already ahead of it. But again, taking that information from the loss runs, analyzing it, and then making some informed decisions on how we're going to move the needle in the right direction really starts to have an impact across the organization. So what does that translate to? Savings. With this being more than just a story, it's a true success case. The broker has been an active member of the safety committee. We've been able to successfully negotiate continued decreases in the client's workers' comp premiums. And that story was also backed up by the carrier's loss control consultant recommendations. So that just provided additional leverage to drive down the costs. And you can see that in 3 years, they will have dropped nearly $600,000 off their annual workers' compensation premiums. The CEO told me that savings, he can now afford to give all of his production workers a $3 increase in pay. And that's going to allow him to hire better employees and provide better benefits, which is great from the recruiting standpoint. And as a side note, I'll just happily boast that our return on investment for this company based on premium was over 300%. So it was just a really good success case, but it was really driven by starting to analyze the data, pulling the loss runs, and then making those informed decisions on how we're going to move the needle in the right direction. This is why you need to hire Bowermaster and ESM, so we can help you get results. Okay, so summary, here are 4 steps. Request and review loss runs monthly or at least quarterly. Don't rely on the system to watch your back. 2, identify trends that are driving injuries and costs. And then 3, develop 3 or 4 risk management initiatives that are going to help you mitigate those trends. And then lastly, measure the results and then pivot when you need to. If you're not achieving your goals, why? And then realign your strategies accordingly. And then last, but definitely not least, ask John for help. And that's where I'm going to hand it back to John. John, back to you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. A ton of information there. And as we always like to say, please get with your Bowermaster advisor. Ask him as many questions as possible if you have them on your loss runs and or your loss history. And it's really important to understand how this affects your operations, as it will ultimately affect your overall premiums. Our next webinar is scheduled for October 17th. And the topic for this webinar is the ESM TAPS process, which is the complete process on how to analyze claims. So make sure you mark your calendar for that. And one last thing I wanted to mention is December 5th is our next HR employment law seminar. More information will be emailed out to everyone on this webinar, but make sure you mark your calendar for that, because you definitely don't want to miss that. So Anthony, thank you again for your time today. Everybody, thank you for attending this webinar, and we look forward to the next one, October 17th. Have a
John,
great day.
I've got a quick question from one of the attendees, and we pseudo covered it, but let me just throw this out there for everybody. The question is, if the employee refused treatment or the injury is less than first aid, do we need to report it to the workers' comp carrier? There's no real black or white answer to that. It's a case-by-case basis for sure. But if the employee is refusing medical treatment, I would have them assign a medical declination form. And then, as I mentioned before, add that to a first aid log and then check back with them in 3 to 5 days. Legally, you have those 5 days to report to the carrier. So you have 5 days to kind of sort it out. And 5 days, you should know whether that employee is healing or not. So again, provide that extra care. It really helps the employee know that you're there to support them. If they need medical treatment within that 5-day period, send them to the clinic and make sure they get proper treatment. So
and also, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, please.
Just talk with your advisor on that one, because we have our claims kit, which has that medical declination form in it. So with that, if you don't have one, definitely talk with your advisor and he can get one to you.
And if you have any additional questions, be sure to just shoot them to John and we'll dig into them. And then what we can do is provide a response to the audience that participated today.
Perfect. Well, thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great day, and we'll be back next month. Take care.